Welcome, everybody. We have a packed agenda here today, so we want to get going. Thank you so much for being with us. Just a couple of reminders. We do record our meetings and then post them to YouTube for those who can attend. And if you're not speaking, if you can remember to keep yourself on mute, that would be great. So good afternoon. Welcome to our monthly WisACT member meeting. Today, we're going to hear from two organizations on a related topic, a very important topic that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. That's political violence. And we're going to leave plenty of time for your questions after both of these presentations. First, I want to make a quick pitch for the Wisconsin Alliance for Civic Trust, for WisACT, for what Scott and I and Allison are up to. In the chat, Allison is going to be posting a link to our online petitions. And we'd love it if you could recruit just a few more members for our organization. Now, we're working out the details, but we do have some of these really awesome, can you see that? Awesome mugs with our logo on it, which we will make available for those of you who do a especially great job of recruiting. So take a look at that link, and it's also on our website under the Join button. Please keep us in mind. Also, toward the end of the meeting today, we're going to ask you to take just a brief survey that was developed by an organization called Root Change, which is evaluating the work that we do and the work that the other 5 networks do in the other 5 states that are being supported by the Carter Center. So thank you in advance for that. Now to our program. I'd like to introduce to you Melanie Phillips of Citizen Data. Melanie is going to be presenting some findings on how different generations of Americans are viewing political violence. And I wonder, Melanie or Grayson, I think, is also on the call. Can you say just a few words before you present about Citizen Data and your methods? Thank you.
Yeah, I can take that. Oh, perfect.
Go for it, Melanie.
I got it. Is it all right if I share slides?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Can everyone see my slides?
You can.
Wonderful. And let me get up my presenter notes as well. It's always the juggling of multiple screens. That is always very fun. 1 second. There we go. Perfect. And we can still see my slides. Awesome. Great. I'm Melanie Phillips. I'm a senior researcher here at Citizen Data and a lecturer in political science. A little bit about Citizen Data. Citizen Data is really working on the back end of things, getting data for impact-driven change that empowers change makers like yourselves with the tools to transcend differences, improve lives, and drive real change. Really sitting in the nonpartisan space and sitting in the let's decrease polarization space and how do we increase engagement in politics, especially in the current ecosystem we live in. We believe in best-in-class analytics, and as some of the leader of the research team, I think our research methods are above reproach in many cases, and are some of the best that we can do in political polling. So a little bit about who you'll be hearing from today. You'll be hearing from me. Also, the call is Grayson. Grayson is our senior manager of strategy and really working with grassroots organizations and working on the action side of the data that we are working with. I'm going to be presenting data from quite a few number of studies. Here is a little background on the number of studies. The sample sizes range from 1,000 all the way up to 2,000 and up into the ends of tens of thousands for some of our political modeling. And the margin of error generally ranges from 2 to 4% on any of these surveys. What I think is really great and what I want to highlight here is that the findings that we're presenting to you today are not findings from just one survey. These are trends that we have documented since we started looking at political violence, especially among generations, since last May. Our most recent actually just came out of the field like a couple days ago. And so these are findings, the majority of them from September. So I want to start off with a positive note and really highlight that the trends we're seeing in the acceptance of political violence, or in this case, the rejection of political violence, are cross-partisan. So looking here, what we have graphed is the responses to the question, which of these would be acceptable for Americans you agree with to politically do against elected officials. I'm noticing the x-axis here got a little funky, but we'll move. I'll walk you through it. On the largest one that you're seeing here, the 74%, the 86%, is none of the above. So the majority, over 75% of Americans across political parties, reject using violence against elected officials. And this trend has held since May. Notably, and what we can say is that after the first assassination attempt, which is a sentence I never thought I would say, we saw a spike among independents and Republicans, and this spike has continued to hold. We didn't see a second spike when we were in the field after the second assassination attempt that we most recently found, but we didn't alternately see any decreases among Democrats. So overall, the majority of Americans across partisan groups reject political violence against elected officials. But looking more deeply into these partisan differences also reveals what I think is some interesting nuances. So when we looked at what scenarios you may feel that election is acceptable, while the majority of the sample says none of the above, you can see that reflected here, about 60% across partisan groups, we do see some interesting variation. So in the dark blue is Democrats, in the light blue is independents, and in the red is Republicans, keeping it to theme. And what we see here is that Republicans are about 2 times more likely than Democrats to agree that violence is acceptable if the government tries to ban firearms. This is, again, this has held consistently since May, and in fact, usually ranges from 2 times to 4 times. So right after the assassination attempt, in fact, we saw that Republicans were 4 times more likely than Democrats to agree that violence is acceptable when the government tries to ban firearms. And Republicans, independents also are 2 times as likely to accept violence in the case when they believe there's election fraud. And so I think this is really important to highlight, in my opinion, because it shows that there is some political sentiment that can be interwoven with the ideas of political violence. And that as discourse around, in this case, both guns and election fraud become very critical in some GOP messaging, that we should find that avoiding these potential partisan labeled framings may be beneficial when it comes to pushing out messages that are aimed to decrease the acceptability of violence. And this isn't just one side of the aisle. On the other side of the aisle, while the gap is not as large, we see that Democrats tend to be more likely to say it's acceptable to accept violence when the government refuses to leave office. So while overall across partisan groups, there's a massive rejection of the acceptability of political violence, we're able to move some individuals, and move not in the way we want to, but we're able to trigger or tap into some political party sentiments when we're discussing very politically salient, partisan-leaning types of core political issues. But what we really are focusing on today is the difference that we do see, which is in generations. So while we see general agreement among partisan groups on the rejection of political violence, where we see notable differences is when we cross-cut the data by generation. So looking here, you have our time trends from May to September. Gen Z is that top line graphed in that dark turquoise. And then we've got millennials, Gen X, and boomers. Silent generation falls in and out of our survey population because they are right now very difficult to survey. If you know any 79-plus-year-olds, please ask them to take more political surveys. We would really like to hear from them. And so as we can see here, this is reflected the percentage of the group indicating at least one form of political violence is acceptable against elected officials. So Gen Z consistently above, starting with a high in May near the 70s, and where we see them in the 50s right now. So 44% of Gen Z believe violence is, only 44% of Gen Z believe a violence against elected officials is never acceptable. So more than half of Gen Z that we're sampling right now believes that there are cases in which violence is acceptable. And this is compared to about 90% of boomers and 81% of Gen X. This is a massive generational divide that we've uncovered. And this is a salient one. This has remained consistent. We found this data in May and we're like, this is alarming. Let's keep studying it. And what we keep finding is more and more evidence that Gen Z and millennials who shift depending on the question really have a very different relationship with the concept of political violence. So And what we think this is important is this isn't just tapping into differences on political violence, but potentially differences in beliefs on what democracy is in America. For example, only 78% of Gen Z and millennials voters feel as if living in a democracy is important. And this is compared to 88% of Gen X and baby boomers. So we again see, we can look at this by situations. So we did this with partisan. Let's look at this by situations. And this is where we really see that Gen Z sees different types of scenarios very differently from other groups. So the significant gap, it continues to be worrisome because Gen Z, especially when we look at these, nearly half believe that it's acceptable to respond with political violence against in these scenarios when the government harasses and imprisons people who criticize political leaders, and almost half when the government tries to ban the possession of firearms. So we see here that while 75% of boomers believe violence is never acceptable in any of these scenarios, only 22% of Gen Z believe that's the case. And so what we see here is overall on all scenarios, Gen Z is the highest, they're in purple. In almost all cases, they're even significantly different from millennials, meaning that it's not just, as a millennial myself, I feel bad blaming the younger generation, but I believe that's, almost tradition. But we see they're significantly different from millennials in most cases, and they're always different from boomers. And when we look at other indicators, we can see that their relationship with democracy is changing. Like we said, they're less likely to believe it's important to live in a democracy. They're more dissatisfied with democracy in the US. And the majority of Gen Z, potentially almost all of Gen Z, when we look at it, have had a very unique experience in our democracy. I would like us to think about the fact that the first election they had probably ever voted in, depending on your definition of when Gen Z counts as, it was 2016. They have consistently seen fair elections denied, have lived with increasing election hostility. They've lived in a world in which polls have varied drastically from outcomes, and they have no benchmark for when American democracy was less polarized or when electoral fear was less salient. The political world in which they live in, I think, is very, very different. They have no benchmark. For example, millennials at least can benchmark back to Obama or potentially even one election previously. And boomers have quite a few more benchmarks. And so I think what we're seeing here is that this has altered their viewing of democracy in the United States and makes it so that key critical democratic ideas, such as the rejection of political violence, might be different for them. And so this led us to looking at political violence across the US. So we know political violence across the US is increasing. It's been increasing for the last 5 years, and it continues to increase. And so we wanted to highlight potential areas of concern, or in the more positive framing, where intervention could be potentially impactful. So through our predictive modeling, we are able to better understand exactly where there's increased risk of violence when, specifically in this case, when individuals don't accept the election results. So here we can see that in the darker blues or purples, that's where election violence risk we predict is the highest. So this is based off of levels of distrust and acceptance of violence. And then in the lighter yellow to orange is where we have the lowest. So the average predicted score by county is about 0.52. It's a 0 to 1 measure. The lowest scoring state was Hawaii. I guess you just can't be upset when you're living in paradise. But the highest scoring state was Texas. And this is not just due to the size of Texas, but looking across the weighted groups of where violence is deemed most acceptable and where there's growing distrust. We can see Wisconsin generally doing it mid to low, and some more higher areas around the borders. And where does this take us? We're all probably very, very busy right now as we're in the final 40 days. And what I think we need to look at is there is still a large gap to be met to get Gen Z engaged in this election. So this is data that we just most recently pulled. I ran a voter readiness index, which was a combination of 7 questions. If you work in public opinion data, you know that like 90 to 100% of all participants say they're going to vote. when we know that's not the case. So in looking at whether or not they're going to vote is not the best predictor. It was actually across these 7 measures, which included, do you know where your polling is? How are you voting? Have you researched issues, candidates? To create what we think is the voter readiness index. And what we can see here, this was between 0 and 30. Overall, voter readiness is high, but it's highest among older generations, and it is lowest among Gen Z. So what we see is Gen Z falls below all other generations on most questions related to voter readiness. So, for example, do you know what next steps you need to take to vote in your state? They're 28% lower than average. Or knowing where their polling place is, 51% lower than average. I will take a note here that this is the only question that silent generation fell below. I do think it's a note to us to always remember that potentially as generations age, these things like knowing where your polling locations might need to be more easily salient information. And voter motivation, which to me, I think is the most critical question. How motivated are you to vote? They're 21% lower than average. And this to me highlights our need as a group to focus a lot of attention on not just go and vote, but all the steps it takes to get to that ballot box and to get to it confidently and to be engaged and satisfied in the process, because Gen Z is far less satisfied. And we see this as potentially changing the way they were relating to democracy, which is correlating with these political violence outcomes. And so how can we do that? So we did a lot of message testing. And so we were testing, well, what messages make people think violence is less acceptable? So here is the overall finding. The overall finding that the best message you can do is fact-based. Non-emotional fact-based messaging based in January 6th. So the top message was more than 2,000 people broke into the US Capitol, looting and vandalizing parts of the building, assaulting approximately 140 police officers, and killing 5 Americans. There's no the dark day, there's no emotional rhetoric. This generally does the best. Notably, though, this is not the case for Gen Z. Gen Z actually scores the best on the last message, which January 6th taught us a painful lesson. We must protect our country from anyone undermining it with election violence. So tapping into the more emotions worked with Gen Z in a way that it doesn't work for the rest of our sample. And to me, what this signals is, one, they both have different views about political violence. They also react to different messaging. And I think this all correlates to they have different views of what they are. If we think about the violent landscape that Gen Z has ultimately grown up in, with protests I mean, I started this presentation talking about 2 assassination attempts. And so I think they are more tapped into that rhetoric than I think the fact-based, more removed, potentially older generations are tapped into. And I think when we can look to some, we have some qualitative data on this. And for one, this quote that stands out from a 26-year-old woman who considers herself an independent. I don't think this would make any difference. We've seen this message many times and nothing has changed. There is a level of dissatisfaction. There's a frustration with the messaging. So I think taking the emotional approach was more successful because it was just acknowledging the truth that I think their reality and their experiences are valid is based in. And when asking again, I'm not sure about the statement. It just seems to be calling on political leaders. And so this idea of which message, if we called on our political leaders to reject violence, and they didn't trust that. So Gen Z also doesn't really count on our political leaders. It's more of on the community that they base themselves in. And what about backlash? So whenever I talk about January 6th, there's always the question of, well, what about backlash, especially among anyone who identifies as conservative? So we can look at these messages on what had the backlash. So in the turquoise, this is the percent who say greatly or somewhat decrease the acceptability. So we actually want the turquoise color. And in the yellow, it says who says greatly or somewhat increases the acceptability of political violence. And so what we see is there's the biggest backlash when it taps into that like old traditional American rhetoric. So Americans choose our leaders with voting, not violence. Let's respect our Constitution and honor the founding fathers standing up for these values. So facts, good strategy. Tapping into like American core ethos, not a successful strategy. This is among the whole sample, and Gen Z follows the same lines. So And I think this quote really explains it. It seems propaganda-y, right? The founding fathers have nothing to do with my dislike of violence. So overall, what we see in the messaging is that the rooting in founding fathers, the Constitution, the old American ideas, the founding doesn't work for any generation. But when we're looking at how to move people on decreasing acceptability, like in the previous slide, Gen Z does check into this political statement. And so I think that's important when we think about their different relationships. And what I would, anyone doing message testing, I really encourage you to think about the fact that Gen Z probably has a different connection with a lot of the terms. And so I want to leave it there. And again, I want to think that and highlight the experience that Gen Z has had in American democracy and why that might be changing what they view as political violence. When looking at the accepted forms, the 45, we alternately ask questions about what type of things they believe they would engage in, and they're more likely to destroy or deface public buildings. They're more likely to forcibly occupy. But the positive note I want to leave us on in Gen Z is that question was always specifically directed towards elected officials. When we changed the framing of the question, we A-B'd it, and we're like, what about towards other Americans? We do not see the same violence or the same acceptability of violence. It actually drastically decreases among Gen Z. So I leave us with this idea that the relationship with political violence is very much a relationship not based on Gen Z potentially being more violent, to hear the potential critiques about video games or something in the background, but really it's their relationship with these institutions that changes how they feel about violence as a strategy. And so I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. Great presentation. Thanks for that important data. Any questions? We have time for a couple here before we move to Mike Ford. And please, if you wouldn't mind just raising your hand, and you can do that. Alex.
Thanks, David. Are we able to get more information on why people feel that violence is warranted? And if we find out those reasons, can we offer them paths to getting what they feel they need that don't involve violence?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We do ask a lot of follow-up questions on like why you believe democracy is weaker, but I think that's a future question on like for anyone who doesn't select none of the above, what is your violence accomplishing? Right now, we're running a big experimental model on trying to define what democracy means for each generation. And so like we're making them run, I'm doing a choice-based experiment, and it has different, like if you had to pick what your democracy is, what does it entail? And what I'm curious, does Gen Z not consider the lack of political violence as vital for a democracy? Or what do they consider? But yeah, that follow-up on like why they want to engage in it, we kind of set the stage for it. We're like either you're contesting the election results or something, but yeah, following up on that would be a really good question. Thanks so much, Alex.
And Lori.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. I just had several questions. First, how many are in each population? And then how did you define violence? Like, did you give them an opportunity to say, it just makes me mad, makes me madder, or it actually motivates me to take action? And then I think the last one, well, I guess I'll just stop there and see what you're thinking.
Yeah. Quick sample one. Generally in each subgroup, depending on the survey, was about 400 to 550. So I wouldn't cut down any further than looking at the subgroup populations. Like what I'm curious about is like gender differences among Gen Z. We don't have the sample size to do that confidently, but feel pretty okay with the sample size. But more N is always better if we could do it. And then how did we define political violence? Yes, we did. In a lot of the surveys, we left it for their interpretation, and then we asked them the scenarios. So like, would you destroy a public building? Would you forcibly occupy? Would you attack or kill an elected official? So we went through and defined different ideas, and Gen Z was the highest on every single one of those, with the highest being on these more protest-laden ideas. So thinking about maybe there's this idea, and there's some arguments in the political science literature that every young generation in their time of being young has been a little bit more politically violent, but Gen Z stands out because of its responses against all these measures.
Great, thank you. Rebecca.
Hi, I apologize for the little bit of the noise. I'm in the state capitol and there's a lot of kids. Just a very quick question. I think you may have just answered it, but of the types of violence that, or did you identify which type of violence was probably the most likely to occur?
The most likely to occur, you mean in the predictive modeling map, or do you mean?
Correct. Well, in terms of, well, partly in terms of the predictive model map, but also in terms of the responses that you got for, especially from the Gen Zers, they tended to be more acceptable of violence.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering at what level did they seem to be the most prone to versus the one they were least prone to?
Yes. So first, like, what situations are they most prone to violence? It's these two: when the government harasses or imprisons people who criticize political leaders, and when the government tries to ban firearms. And then let me see if I have the slide in my appendix. If not, I will just talk you through it. This is the types of violence they're willing to do. This is towards other Americans. So all the numbers are higher if you ask towards elected officials, but these are the categories we used. So kill or physically harm, forcibly occupy, destroy or deface, protest with weapons, harass or intimidate, and publish personal information. So these are all the definitions we did. And the lowest among elected officials is still the kill or physically harm, but the highest is forcibly occupy and destroy or deface. And in many follow-up cases, Gen Z doesn't consider those forms of violence. And so let's see, do we have the other slide? And then this is also, sorry, this is on here as well, so my little supplemental data that Gen Z does feel the least informed about the elections. So in line with that. But yeah, so in general, what we find is that they're the highest on the forcibly occupy or destroy. I think this is in line with a lot of the engagements with protests that we see among younger generations. And interestingly enough, not as much so with published personal information or harass or intimidate online, which you might expect to be higher. But I can make sure that we follow up and share the graph that's against elected officials right after this as well, with that graph as well.
Melanie, would we be able to get your slides and share them with our group?
Yeah, no problem. Let me update that, put that new figure in, and then fix that one x-axis, and then I'll share them today.
That's great. Any other questions for Melanie?
Yeah.
David.
Hoover. Melanie, I totally get the response from Gen Zs that, yeah, living in a democracy is not critical. I mean, it's been a crazy time for all of us and them. But did the survey go into, so what kind of system would you like to live in? A better democracy or something, or was there another name, another system?
Yeah, so that's the experiment that I have out right now. So essentially we took anything from like, oh, do you want to live in a place where there's economic equality and universal living, to human rights protections, to more meritocracy based. So it randomized all these different attributes, and it asked participants, you can live in country A or country B. And so I will get back to you shortly with those results because they're still in the field. But yeah, what I'm wondering, yeah, okay, Gen Z, you're unhappy with democracy. What about it would you choose? Like, what aspect of living in a somewhat democratic or not democratic state would make you choose a country or another? And so I'd be happy to share those results once we have them written up, but it takes a little more analytical effort. But yeah, because I'm curious, okay, is it because maybe they have a more doll-based definition of democracy. So they want maximal democracy, meaning they want equality, universal protections, human rights protections, equal civil participation. Or are they more libertarian in what they want and they just want the government out of their business? Like, what about it would change whether they evaluate a certain country in the hypothetical? So David, I'll definitely respond once I have that written up, because I'm incredibly fascinated as well.
Great, thank you. Well, we're going to leave that part of the meeting there. Melanie and Grayson, thanks so much for being with us today. It's fascinating data, scary in a way, but we really appreciate it. Now I want to turn to my colleague Scott McCallum to introduce our next presenter, Mike Ford.
Timely in what we are doing, and Melanie, thank you for the presentation. It caught my eye when it came through from the start, and I thought this is something we really ought to delve into. But I'd like to say for the participants as well, we've had some pretty good programs lately on where society is trending with Charles Franklin in their last report with Wisconsin, and now this. And I think it really highlights how important it is for you to be involved and for us to take steps in WisACT. And so just let me say it is important. We can make a difference, and it follows a number of the things we're doing, including some upcoming events that we've got going on. Now, with that, one of the steps we have taken in Wisconsin is to try to look further in depth beyond the polling, and did a series of focus groups around the state. We called them listening sessions, but in effect, they were focus groups to get in depth on a number of the different issues. Michael Ford, Dr. Michael Ford, the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, is the executive director, is the director of the Whitburn Center, which specifically looks at local governments and how to make local governments more efficient. Through these series of focus groups, there are a number of very interesting results. We will be releasing the entire report at the training sessions we've got in Milwaukee on October 8th and in Green Bay on October 15th. You can pre-register for those on the website as well. And those are steps on de-escalation and what we can do to prevent further violence, to try to protect our institutions. Dr. Ford has done a number of reports on these things. He's done an excellent job on this, I will say. While we're releasing the full report, we thought it tied in really well with the work that you are doing as members of WisACT, and what the polling and other research is showing is important. And that is the growing trend towards violence in our system. So with that, let me turn you over to my colleague, somebody I've worked with for a number of years and think very highly of his work and the job he's doing with running the Whitburn Center, Dr. Michael Ford.
Thank you, Governor McCallum. Appreciate that. Can you see my screen, I presume? All right, thank you, David. And Melanie, great job. That was a fascinating presentation. So as Scott said, this is the result of 5 listening sessions we did across the state of Wisconsin over the summer. And I do want to highlight Dr. Samantha Larson, who's the research director at the Whitburn Center and a professor of public administration at UW Oshkosh, who's on this call as well. And Sam, feel free to chime in. And then Lisa Lewis, who also is Whitburn Center staffer who worked on this project. So some of the background here, we had 3 broad research questions we went into this with. First, how serious of a threat do leaders in Wisconsin believe political violence and election distrust really are in Wisconsin? So we wanted to dig down into our local communities to really understand what local leaders thought, not just broad public opinion, but those that are in these leadership positions. What do they think are the causes of this distrust? And then most important, how can violence be mitigated? And how can we increase support for fair, safe, and secure elections in Wisconsin? So as Governor McCallum stated, we had these 5 listening sessions, and very important to point out, as he did, these were more focus groups. They were invite only. The sessions were 2 hours long, they were semi-structured, and they were moderated by myself. We had 5 sessions between June 8th and August 17th in Oshkosh, Milwaukee, Madison, Eau Claire, and Green Bay. The dates were important, I think, because between the Milwaukee and Madison session is when we had the first assassination attempt on former President Trump. So that did change our script a little bit as we started leading with that question after the Milwaukee session. Though I will say the Madison session was kind of intense because that was like 2 days afterwards. But by the time we got to Eau Claire and Green Bay, people seemed to have moved on a little bit, which says something. I'm not quite sure how to write that up, but it does say something. So I think we were successful in getting a pretty good cross-section of grass tops. So it's important to understand the grass tops approach. This is not meant to be a representative sample of residents of these communities. These were meant to be community leaders. We had a total of 32 people who participated across the 5 sessions. We recruited them primarily utilizing our own networks, either through the Whitburn Center or the UW Oshkosh MPA program, or especially in Green Bay, utilizing some of the connections through the Wisconsin Alliance for Civic Trust. 56% of our participants were male, 84.4% were white. I think we had good ideological diversity, but as we highlight in the report, the most underrepresented group tended to be the ones that are most identified with election denialism. I think we did have some representation from individuals supporting those groups or members of those groups, but I want to keep that in mind. I won't read you the whole list, but you see we had a really nice group of individuals who are current elected officials, former elected officials, people that are running for office, folks that are in local government, journalists, researchers, people running local chapters of the Republican Democratic Party, some private sector folks, and some election clerks. So people that we believe do have a pulse on their communities. So we recorded these, not for public consumption, but for our own coding purposes, because we did promise to keep the names of the individuals anonymous, as well as their specific organizations anonymous. And through the coding, we identified 6 major themes, and I'll list the 6 major themes here, and then a couple quotes that I think give you the flavor of it. So the first major theme that was kind of shocking was just the extent of the personal experience that people in the room had with threats of political violence, and the extent to which the folks were expecting more political violence. That first quote I had to share because there's an expletive there, but I bleeped it out for you. But I think that was pretty representative across all 5 sessions, with a couple exceptions of individuals in the room that folks were very worried that there's going to be more, not just threats, but actual acts of political violence around this election, particularly folks worried at the local level about local election clerks. Second major theme was this desire for civil discourse, that everyone's in favor of civility. But once you start to get to that next level of questioning, like, what do you mean by civil discourse? That's where the disagreement starts to come around, and that's where the blame starts to go. Right, I'm all for civil discourse, but the problem is the folks on the left, or folks on the right are not engaging in civil discourse. So I think that there's something to be said here about getting everybody on the same page when we talk about vague concepts like civil discourse. One theme I wasn't expecting, perhaps I should have been expecting, was the third one here. And this presence of the link between political violence and the rhetoric of violence and broader cultural decline. This came up pretty regularly, that when we're having this discussion about political violence, that we're not just talking about the state of our politics, we're talking about the state of our culture and the state of our society, and the extent to which violence is just something we're exposed to on a regular basis, whether it's the threat of school shootings, the pervasivity of mass shootings, culture, et cetera. That came up, and I thought that was concerning, but I also thought that gave me some hope in that perhaps there's something we can do about that. The fourth major theme, lack of trusted information sources, and certainly social media came up over and over again, and how people feel not entitled, but feel safe saying things on social media or via email in an anonymous realm that they wouldn't do face to face, that they wouldn't do in person, and how that has really lowered the level of discourse and the way people are more willing to engage in threatening rhetoric when they don't think they're going to be exposed or identified as the messenger. The decline of print media, especially in smaller markets, came up over and over again as well. That essentially we have populations that are out there finding their own media sources, and they tend to be national media sources. So a lot of these national issues tend to dominate the local discourse, and that prevents us from breaking down some of those political silos, and that raises the collective temperature in our local communities around issues that maybe don't have a lot to do with what's actually happening at the local level. The fifth major theme, I think, ties into the fact that we were dealing with elites in our listening sessions. And that was that the folks in the room, with a few exceptions, expressed a general trust in elections. We did have a few folks that said, yeah, I trust my local election officials, but I don't necessarily trust the election officials in other communities, which I thought was fascinating as well. But all of them, I should say, again, always with exceptions, but most of the individuals did say that they were very concerned about the growing distrust in elections in our society and among others in their communities. So kind of the 1-2 questions I would ask is, do you trust your local election results? And they'd say yes. And I'd say, do you think your community members do? And then they'd say no. The sixth major theme was concern that potential candidates are tuning out of politics and public life. And not just potential political candidates, but folks that would formerly be willing to engage in civic life, in civic discourse, that some of our best and brightest just are avoiding public life, avoiding public discussion. This quote here, which I'll paraphrase, I think, put it really well, that, hey, politics is a sewer. It's only going to attract people that want to swim in the sewer. I don't want to swim in that sewer, so I'm just not going to be involved. So people checking out was a major, major concern. So then the harder question, what do we do about it? Now, this is probably self-serving, but I think the best thing we can do about it is attend our 2 de-escalation trainings on October 8th and October 15th that Governor McCallum mentioned. But certainly giving people the formal tools to have those difficult conversations, whether that's with family, with neighbors, to have productive political discourse, know how to de-escalate when that temperature does rise. Our second recommendation is to find ways to give people more formal exposure to electoral processes. A really common theme in our focus groups was like, hey, I was skeptical about elections, but then I volunteered to be an election worker. And after going through that process, I really started to trust it. So the more that we can get people to not just observe it, but to actually be part of it and take ownership over it, I think that would be a really good way to increase trust, especially if you can find people who are trusted individuals within their communities or within their political parties. The third one is engaging with reports like the one put out by the Legislative Audit Bureau that identified ways that elections could be improved in Wisconsin. And I think this ties into a larger discussion we had in all 5 of our sessions about the need to be able to discuss ways we can improve elections without it devolving into a dichotomous discussion of either you think elections are perfect or you don't believe in election results. There was a broad desire that, hey, we can say that there are ways we can improve our processes without saying that results are illegitimate. And there are formal reports like the Legislative Audit Bureau, and I believe the Institute for Law and Liberty put out a report as well that identified some things that could be part of the public discussion that revolve around how to improve elections without devolving into delegitimizing the results of our democratic processes. The fourth was having more nonpartisan election trainings. And this ties into discussions about the way more and more of our processes have become dominated by the political parties. And if we could have election trainings that are generally accepted as nonpartisan and not tied to one political party or another, that's one way we can lower the temperature around our democratic processes and make sure that exists outside of our usual partisan framing. The fifth one ties to that larger, I guess, social decline. And this one's really fascinating. After hearing Melanie present about Generation Z and some of their I guess, proclivity or more openness to different forms of government. And this is just increasing civic education in K-12 schools and being able to show the next generation how democracy works, and demonstrate that, hey, maybe what you're witnessing from 2016 to today is not the entire history of our republic, nor how it's supposed to operate. Then sixth, finding local efforts to increase bridging social capital, whether that is things like neighborhood associations, but things that give people exposure to individuals they may disagree with politically, but doing it in a non-political, nonpartisan space so that we can have that trust in one another, even if we do disagree politically. Because that came up over and over again, the extent to which individuals are siloing one another and only being exposed to other people who share their political views, and how that has been toxic for our political trust, and I guess proclivity for political violence. So that's a real quick teaser for the report that's going to come out on the 8th. It'll obviously be posted on our website and elsewhere, but happy to answer any questions about the process or anything else. And I know that Dr. Larson's here as well, and I'm hoping she'll be happy to answer any questions that may come up. So I can end this show and open it up to the floor.
And again, for those members, we're encouraging a number of steps, training sessions we've got going on the 8th and the 15th, and there'll be more detail. You're saying we're just going on the surface of this and won't get into it in this program on the details, but we'll also be having another online program at the end of October as part of this monthly member meeting, which will go a little bit longer on de-escalation training. It also points out, if I could just give a pitch again, as David did at the beginning, the more people involved, the easier it's going to be for those that are working to be able to speak out in opposition to violence and taking the steps that are necessary in toning down the heated level involved in politics. So with that, anybody can go to one of the petitions on our join page. You go to the join page, there's a link, print off one of the petitions and just circulate it when you go to the high school football game, or you go to your coffee or your breakfast meeting or a family event. Just circulate it and send it in. The more people we have involved, the easier it's going to be. In particular, we know some of our regional directors and others are doing media events and speak out in local communities. They need to know there's a number of people behind them, that they're not alone. So with that, get the hands raised or any questions for Dr. Ford or Samantha.
Rebecca?
Just one quick question, and maybe this is not appropriate for here, maybe it is, I'm not sure. As far as the K through 12 education and the civic involvement with that, do you have any recommendations of how to interact with the schools? Some schools do this, some schools don't, to help them to identify when bias is being shown to the kids for one political party versus another, rather than just generally teaching the kids the civics and how to make their own choices. Does that make sense?
That does. That's a good question. You know, when you started asking that question, I go back to, you know, one of my dreams is that every local grade school has a local government day where they learn kind of the nuts and bolts, including you know, how elections operate, what a clerk does, et cetera, kind of to dovetail off the kind of the state government curriculum they already have. But that doesn't get at what you were asking there, Rebecca. So I'm going to hand that over to the floor. I don't know if anybody has an answer to that question.
Well, I'll just say there are some things that are run outside of the school system in teaching. The Rotary does a very nice program. throughout. Well, actually, they invite people internationally to the program as well. YMCA Youth in Government program. So there are different things outside the school system. It may also be a generational gap. Many of us were brought up understanding at least some of the basics of the system. And I'm not sure that continues to exist. Allison and I just presented at the University of Wisconsin-Madison a number of political science majors, and I teach in Milwaukee, and it's surprising to me each time um, how little really is known how our system, how our government works.
Yeah, so Lori has a nice note in there in the chat about the League of Women Voters having some tools there to help kids register to vote, and then Girls and Boys State. I will say too that I know that the public school curriculum does have some interesting things about how to identify a credible media source. They do some work with media literacy, but I do think it tends to be more scattershot as opposed to really tied toward building trust.
And I should have mentioned the Boys and Girls State as well. And just so members know, we did reach out to them early on in this. It was too late for the programming this year, but it's one of the organizations, two of the organizations we hope to have a relationship with in the future.
Well, Mike, thank you to you and your team at Whitburn for this great report. Again, that'll be available on our website and also through Whitburn, and available at our training sessions on the 8th and the 15th, 8th in Milwaukee, the 15th in Green Bay. And Nathan Stock, are you still on the call?
I am on the call.
Nathan, I'm going to surprise you. I wonder if you could chat just for a moment. Take 1 minute and talk about the next meeting. So our next meeting will be a special meeting that Nathan will help lead, focused on some of these issues.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Dave. So, well, first of all, I just want to just say a quick note of thanks to Dr. Ford for the work on the 4 listening sessions. I think at this point you all have a flavor of the work that WisACT's been supporting, running listening sessions, trying to educate about local election processes, increasingly trying to push out messaging designed to reduce fear of our fellow Americans that is often the trigger to violence. The one other piece of this that we hope to put in place for the election is a rapid response plan. Governor McCollum and David have been working to develop a system in Wisconsin of sort of regional coordinators trying to figure out who's going to cover different corners of the state. This workshop over 2 hours is going to build on that. It's going to share recommendations for how to talk about potential violence without inflaming the problem. It's going to build out an internal communication plan. So for the network members who want to be involved in this, who calls who if there's a problem? How do we talk to each other quickly and coordinate responses? And then we'll go through some scenario planning informed by best practices around non-violent options for countering political violence. We'll talk through things that might happen around the election and how the network might engage. So if you're at all interested in this topic, I think you'll find this session extremely interesting. And, we'd love to have all hands on deck for helping us to manage this. Does that make sense? Any questions?
That's great. Thanks, Nathan.
Well,
Alex, you have a question?
Yes, regarding the rapid response, how do we engage with that? Where do we go to sign up?
The next meeting.
You'll be able to sign up. Members can sign up. It'll be the same time we usually have this meeting. It'll be October 30th, and it'll take place at noon. It'll go longer than the usual 1 hour we have for this. I believe it's a 2-hour training session.
Yeah.
And encourage as many others, again, back to petitions and membership. And there are some other organizations we will be partnering with inviting their participation as well.
Right. And details on that will be in the newsletter starting tomorrow, the one you get tomorrow, and then each week up until the event. And details there also on the events that we have upcoming. And look for more information as Allison and the rest of the team begin to plan some events in Madison too for students there. Well, thank you, everybody. This was great. Thanks for all your time. We really appreciate it.